Good evening, World Mythologies class, or good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you're watching this, whenever you're watching this. Uh, this is Adam, your professor, and today I'm going to start a series of a couple of videos on our theoretical concerns in the study of world mythology. So I want to start by talking about what mythology is. So it comes from the Greek word mythos, which means story. There's a lot of different meanings that it's had over the centuries, but its basic meaning is like a narrative or a story. It's something that can be contrasted with another Greek word, historia, which comes to us from Aristotle, which is a story with some sort of like evidence perhaps attached to it. So we even have in the ancient Greeks a distinction, an early distinction in the, I would say 500s BCE, distinction coming between stories that are meant to relay some sort of something that is a story that happened, and those stories that they relate truths, but they don't necessarily have that same sort of truthiness to them. I know that we live in a world of fake news and everything, but the interesting thing is with mythology and our study of mythology is that mythology deals with what you might call enduring truths about human nature, truths about the way people relate to each other, truths about how people come together in societies and build communities. And in that sense, mythology, like history, is a very, very important thing to study. History, something that I studied a lot in graduate school, is the use of evidence to reach conclusions. And you argue from the basis of the evidence, and you try to make the best argument you can. You can never recreate the past, but you try to make the best case on the basis of the evidence for what happened in the past. That is the basic role of history as a discipline. Mythology, on the other hand, speaks to the human condition on a more fundamental level. The truths that we speak of are moral truths, truths about the way people relate to each other, truths about how they build their communities, and the stories that they share with their children to build just a way of looking at the world, a worldview, a cosmogony, as it were. So mythology is really, really interesting in that way. And one of the things that you guys have seen is that I have readings on the syllabus. Well, if we were going to do mythology the right way, we would just share stories. I always say this, the best way to teach this course would be to share stories around a fire, outside, recreate that pre-modern world as best we could, where we are sharing stories about where we came from, where we're going, the disasters that we've survived. There's a lot of flood narratives in the world of ancient myth because floods were something that could destroy your livelihood and destroy your life. There are flood narratives in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are flood narratives in the Hebrew Bible. And there's a flood narrative with Deucalion and Pyrrha, his wife, in the Greek mythology as well. There's a lot of flood narratives out there. So these are stories that are told. These are stories that are passed down from generation to generation and generation. So how we're actually approaching mythology is not how people approached the stories about their lives and where they came from for the longest time. And of course, mythology is connected to religion, the rites and rituals, the things that people do to affirm themselves as a community and make sense of the gods and goddesses they believe in as well, with the same supernatural foundation. So when we have mythology, what we've got is the stories, the traditions that we share, not this artificial reading that we do now. Now when we do this, we read. We read these stories, and it's almost like they're stuck in time. Anthropologists and armchair anthropologists go to different cultures and different indigenous traditions around the world. I mean, Snorri Sturluson with the Norse, this Christian guy, is basically recording the stories and basically taking the stories of the Norse and filtering them through his worldview and making this and changing the stories by the very act of writing them down and sort of freezing them in time. So the way we study mythology is not necessarily the way mythology is as a lived moment from day to day among people in a shared community of belief and a shared community of belief and tradition. So with that, let's talk about mythology and the different kinds of myths and what distinguishes myths from legends, etc. So oral traditions come down to us, and there are stuff like fairy tales and fables, and oftentimes there's animal creatures. And they're meant to teach a basic moral lesson, and they're usually meant to teach children a way to be. If you don't be like this person, don't be like the animal in this story because this is what could happen to you. Don't be like the boy who cried wolf in one of these fables, because if you're doing that and then there actually is a wolf and you're crying wolf and people are like, well, guess what? He is faking us out all the time. Well, now his sheep are going to be eaten. So don't be like him. So these are cautionary tales. You may be familiar with Grimm's fairy tales. The Disney versions that we have are often sanitized, cleaned up versions of very brutal, gritty stories that were meant to sort of teach children the way to be in a pre-modern, rural, world in Europe at the time. So the Brothers Grimm are literally the people who are freezing these stories in time by writing them down. So oral traditions, they're not fairy tales. They're also not legends. So legends are a little bit different because legends have some sort of root in history, something that may have happened. But the stories that accrue around these events become something, what we say, of legend. So I'll give you an example. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Was there perhaps a group of Romano Britons sort of trying to unify the English Isle during the 8th century of the Common Era, perhaps? Who knows? But the stories of King Arthur, the idea of the sword and the stone, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, these sort of supernatural events that are connected to, Merlin, the wizard, right? These are legends, and they're slightly different from myths. They don't necessarily teach the same things, but they are in the same category. Myths are, unlike fairy tales, which are primarily meant to teach a moral lesson, and legends, which connect a people to a culture and to a reality through heroes, in this way, through ancient past heroes. Myths are even broader than that. You could have creation myths, and creation myths tell people where they come from. So the myth that I'm most familiar with is the story of, in the book of Genesis, in the Hebrew Bible, of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. That is a creation myth. There's the creation myth of Marduk versus Tiamat in the Babylonian creation myth, in a Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian sort of worldview, the Mesopotamian. There's Set and Osiris and Isis and Horus, that sort of creation myth about where, Osiris becomes sort of the zombie god of the underworld. And it's a really crazy story. You're going to read that. You've got creation myths. Every culture has one. And the reason they're so important is because something has to order the chaos that came before it. And in fact, in the Greek mythology, you have sort of this chaos, and from it you get these primordial gods that in themselves become creative moments. For example, Gaia, Mother Earth, through Uranus, creates many, many offspring. The chief of which are the Titans, but there's also the Hecatoncheires, the 100-armed ones, the Cyclops. There's a lot going on that we'll study there. So with myths, you've got creation myths, but you've also got stories about families and drama associated with that. So you have a lot of myths that have what you would just say is like just a lot of drama. And the best example of this is Zeus in the Greek myths, right? Zeus is like basically having children with everyone and everything, and Hera doesn't like it, and there's a lot of tension there between them. And so you've just got all of these stories that we can relate to. The gods are kind of like us. And that is really interesting in some ways, because there are some stories where the gods or God isn't like us. Or maybe he or she is. Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. Very, very different than the Greek gods, but perhaps relatable in some ways, perhaps not in others. But yeah, they're just like us. Those magazines, the stars, they're just like us. Well, the gods, they're just like us. Very, very interesting connection. And what does that tell us about who we are? Do we want to be better than the gods? Or the gods, do we want to make them happy? There's this myth about Prometheus tricking the gods, helping humans trick the gods to offer them a sacrifice and saving the meat for themselves, but making the gods believe that they are always doing the right thing. So there's a lot of stuff going on there with the gods, and I think part of it is people just love hearing stories. They love it when there's a lot of drama and a lot of action, and you have all these different gods with different powers. For example, Apollo is both the god of the sun, but he's also the god of prophecy and healing and plague, right? And he makes an important appearance in the Iliad, where the daughter of one of his priests in the temple has been kidnapped or has been captured by a raiding party among the Greeks, the Achaeans, and the priest prays to Apollo to send a plague upon the Achaean, the Greek camp, the Argive camp, and Apollo does. And this is sort of the beginning of the Iliad, because then you have this conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles when they decide that they have to give the daughter of the high priest back. So there's a lot of different powers there. His sister Artemis is the goddess of the moon. You have, among the Egyptians, you've got Thoth, the god of wisdom. You have the two cat goddesses, one that's sort of the violent, angry one, Sekhmet, and then the more civilized one, Bastet. There's a lot of going on there. And in the Egyptians, of course, you get the zoomorphism with the animal heads. So I think a lot of this is that people want to relate to, but also be different from the gods, and they want it to be exciting and interesting. I want this course to be exciting and interesting because I love studying mythology and I love the stories. And that's why I have the unit on pop culture, because it's really, really a good connection to the world of mythology. We are still mythologizing today. We've never stopped. We're just doing it in different media in different ways now than the ancients did. But we are still we absolutely crave stories. And that brings me to my next thing. What do we crave? We crave heroes. And so we've talked about creation, we've talked about family drama, but we crave heroes. We want the heroes. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, Superman, right? And later on, Neo from The Matrix, the movie, right? And you've got people who are, you're looking for that person, that someone who is going to save the day. And that is what Joseph Campbell, one of the first major theorists and scholars of world mythologies, actually articulated. He articulated this vision of a monomyth, the hero's journey. And it's this idea of going from the ordinary world into an extraordinary world, and then having to save the day and coming back with some sort of elixir or knowledge at the end. And there are many, many great examples of this. I'll be talking more about this later. But the hero journey is one of those fundamental elements of world mythology. It's a plot archetype. We're going to be talking about archetypes some more in the next video. But hero journeys, threshold tales is often what they're called, because the hero has to pass a threshold from the ordinary world into the extraordinary world. A couple more examples of this in modern times would include Star Wars and, of course, Harry Potter. Harry Potter lives on Privet Lane, and I believe that's the name of it, and he gets sucked into the world of Hogwarts, and that's where his adventure begins. So you've got all of that going on in mythology as well. The story of Perseus versus Medusa is a really good example of this. Heracles is another one. From the very get-go, he's thrown into the world when Hera tries to send snakes to kill him as an infant, and he strangles them, because this is like a sign of his strength to continue moving forward with his mythos, his story. And of course, he's later deified because of his connection to his father, Zeus. So we've talked about myths as oral traditions. We've talked about creation myths a little bit. We've talked about family drama that's involved in heroes. But let's not forget the tricksters. These are plot driver types. These are characters that drive plots and myths and legends and stories in ways because they're just different. They're amoral. They act for their own interests. And they're often doing things just to see what happens. Loki in Norse mythology is a great example of this. And this is actually an example of one way I think Marvel did a really good job with the character Loki, because they made Loki kind of do what he wants to do, and sometimes he's helping Thor, and sometimes he's not helping Thor. Obviously, the first Avengers movie there, if you've seen that. So that's an example from pop culture, but in the Norse mythology, Loki is certainly a trickster, but so is Odin. Odin is the one-eyed trickster. He gave his eye up so he could have the wisdom of the runes. He hung on the tree for 9 days. This guy's got a lot going on. So we've got trickster types. Anance the spider is another great example. And we've got coyote, and we've got other creatures. They're oftentimes trickster types are identified with marginal creatures that are on the margins. They aren't really accepted within society. Like a coyote is not really a strong creature. It's kind of just out there. You would never have a trickster type kind of be like some noble animal, like a lion, for example. Lions don't represent that. But spiders and coyotes and sometimes some other crows, for example, might be a trickster type character. You've got a lot going on with tricksters there too. So we've got tricksters, we've got heroes, and now let me just talk a little bit about some of the basic things, characteristics of myth. They deal with fundamental truths. We talked about that. The hearers, and we're talking the hearers, in the pre-modern world, the hearers of the myth gained a kind of knowledge moving forward. And they really had to you have to internalize the lesson of the myth. Myths are meant to teach something. I often say this to my classes, that mythology and religion are really studies in child psychology, because what do people do? They educate their children in their worldview from a very early age. And as those neural pathways are being set, children are trained to think in a certain way moving forward. This is why religion and mythology and everything is just so ingrained together in our culture. Like the stories from a culture are connected to the religion of a culture. And sometimes those religions have died out. For example, you don't have a lot of people nowadays. There might still be some. I actually had a student once who told me that there are still people in Greece who believe in the Olympian gods and goddesses, but you don't have a majority of people doing that around the world. Most people, however, around the world belong to there's three major Western traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and those religious communities are connected to foundational myths such as the Garden of Eden, the Book of Genesis, like I said, with the story of Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, and the serpent. So you've got sometimes a mythos connected still very intimately to the religions around the world, and you have sometimes where there's less of that connection today because perhaps that tradition died out somehow or changed or got absorbed into another tradition. And so that's why when we study these ancient mythologies, I'm fascinated by them. I love studying the ancient ones that maybe there are some remnants of them that still exist in certain ways today, and maybe not. There are scholars, I've got a book on my shelf here about a scholar who's looking for like the myth, like what was the story from which all the other stories branched out. And that's kind of controversial because some people think that there was some sort of single story, single source from which all the other mythologizing came. And other people say no, different myths from different specific places around the world have their own unique genesis. And they share patterns, they share things, but they came from different places. And this is something we have to think about. Like, was there one single myth, or are there many different myths that just happen to share things in common? This is why Joseph Campbell is interesting, because he thinks that the patterns and stuff, there's something about the human mind. He's with Jung here, the idea of the archetypes. He's got this idea that people, we all share this sort of characteristic to think in certain ways about things, and that there might have been some sort of source, some sort of primal source of mythology. It's very, very interesting. The great thing about Joseph Campbell, though, I should post a video of him. There's one on Netflix. There's a whole series with Joseph Campbell. But Joseph Campbell is just fascinated by how much we love stories and just what they can tell about us and about a culture and about what people value. I mean, it's really, really interesting how this guy was so in tune with the way myths speak to who we are as a people. All right, so I talked about the different kinds of myths. I talked about them being from oral traditions. Let me discuss a little bit about your first assignment. So you've got the assignment, two assignments due next week, I believe. One is on the traits, the equations for building an archetype. So you have to sort of figure out this quality plus that quality equals this archetype and give some examples. That is an interesting assignment. One of the examples from each one should come from the world of ancient myth. So just make sure you're familiarizing yourself with the readings to help you along the way and the videos. The other assignment is to build an ancient Near Eastern underworld. And a lot of you are probably scratching your head. What is this guy thinking? What is this guy doing? Well, I come from a Montessori teaching background. And what I learned as a Montessori teacher is that students learn best when they're doing things actively, not when you're just passively receiving information. When you actually have to build something, create something on your own, be it a paper, traditional, or a diorama, or something else, you take more ownership of it. It seems kind of silly at first sometimes, but once you get into it, you realize, wow, I'm actually learning something in a real way, and not just in a way it's going to go in one ear and out the other. Because I know how that kind of learning works. It doesn't stick. And what's the point? I mean, what's the point of being here if you're not going to learn something, right? So I actually was just talking to my son, and he showed me the Minecraft Nether, and he's like, oh yeah, you can go in creative mode, and you can create all sorts of things. So if you're into anything like that, you can build a Minecraft underworld. There's all sorts of characteristics, right? You could have some sort of threshold guardian. You could have like the feature of like you eat something in this underworld and you have to stay. I mean, this is Ereshkigal and her sister Ishtar. Like, we got a lot of stuff going on. This is, of course, Persephone and Hades. Like, you've got that. Like, you could have the idea of like rewards and punishments. Like, what happens? How do you get to this afterlife? Is it more like a heaven, or is it more like a hell, right? So, an ancient Near Eastern underworld, interestingly enough, not quite as well developed in certain senses compared to later ones that built on top of them. I've been reading some books about this for a paper that I'm working on, and what I found really interesting is that you really don't have an obsession with the afterlife the way you think you do. Like, I come from a Christian background, and of course the obsession with the afterlife, for me, it's a natural thing. Like, what's going to happen? This sort of linear thinking. But you didn't really have this obsession with the afterlife in many cultures the way we do now. Now, of course, an exception you might say would be the Egyptians, because of all the ancient rites and rituals that went with mummification and sending the spirit off into to the world, and you want to weigh the heart and all that. But not the Mesopotamians did not spend as much time thinking about this, perhaps, as the Egyptians did, and certainly not as much as some of the later religions like Christianity and Islam, for example. So, with that assignment, if you need help, email me. I will help you. There are elements of an ancient Near Eastern underworld or an afterlife you have to think about. Typically, there's this belief in like water surrounding everything. As the Greeks believe this too. If you look at some of the texts in Genesis, you're going to see like the waters around the earth and all this stuff. God, different creation, levels there. And their idea of like being under the earth is also something really interesting that you want to think about. That's why with the nether stuff was really interesting. Just talking to my son, just about all the different creatures and all the different things that can go on there. The crazy thing about the Minecraft nether is it does more like a hellscape kind of, but that's not necessarily what an ancient Near Eastern underworld looked like. So I want you to read the myths and do some extra research and see what you come up with. I'm really, looking forward to see what you have for this assignment. This is where you can get creative. I will just, off the bat, tell you, I'm all about creativity. If I can be creative and do something, I love the project. If I can't, I'm kind of bored. So, that's just full disclosure from me as your professor. I love being creative, and when I'm creative, I remember. And that's the whole point. I want you guys to leave this course with a toolbox with which to approach the study of mythology, the critical evaluation of different claims, different cultures around the world and their myths and what that tells us about them. I really want you to have that appreciation and that critical piece to go with it. But I can't do it without this creative moment as students. I just really want you to have those creative moments where you really are, come together and you think, okay, how is this going to be? So this video is getting a little bit longer than I wanted. I just wanted to comment briefly on the assignment there with the ancient Near Eastern underworld. The other one is a little more self-explanatory. I will be doing another video on archetypes, and then after that I will start talking Mesopotamian and Egyptian mythology. I'm going to try and keep the videos under 25 minutes. I was going to say under 20 minutes, but under 25 minutes. And that's that. So thank you for listening. Have a great day.